Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Reverend G. I am Reverend Grenetta Mason, aka Reverend G, and I'm here every Monday night bringing you special guests from all walks of life with different perspectives. And we have conversations about life, love, and spirituality. And we talk about spirituality from a practical point of view. How does it support you in your everyday life? What spiritual practices do you have as your go to practices when you're feeling frustrated or when you need clarity or when you're sad? And I talk about the spiritual toolkit, and that spiritual toolkit is very personal because we each have the practices that support us at different times. My guests, we talk about the practices that they have and that we use in order to support you in exploring more practices, giving you clarity around some of the practices. One of the things that I hope we do is we leave you touched, moved, and inspired to take your life on because my goal is to support you in living your best life in joy with grace and ease. You can find me every day on Facebook as Reverend Grenetta Mason, also on Instagram as Rev Grenetta. Follow me on YouTube as Reverend Grenetta Mason. Tonight, I have a very, very special guest that I'm excited to have the conversation with, Michael Stern. Michael is a coach and a social entrepreneur. I'm so excited for Michael to share with you all the things that he's doing. And let's get this conversation started, Michael. Welcome to the show.
What's up, Rev G? Thank you for having me. So good to see you.
You too. Michael and I, we've known each other for a few years. And when you meet somebody for the first time and you just really have a special connection, I met him on a long car ride, right? Where at his first retreat. And so in that ride, we had some really great conversations. And then we realized that we were connected in one way, right? And so from there, we've developed a really great relationship. So Michael, tell them who you are. I used to give these broad categories, but talk about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again for having me, for inviting me on. This is fun. So yes, I'm a coach. I'm trained as an emotional intelligence coach in the work of Daniel Goleman, author of the book Emotional Intelligence. And I'm also a social entrepreneur, as you mentioned. Our mutual friend, Chelsea Simpson, is my co-founder at the Emerging Leaders Project, where we're trying to support social change, conscious social change leaders through developing community at the intersection of personal and collective transformation. So that takes up a big chunk of my time. And then I also work as the business operations manager for a meditation teacher. So I'm sure we can get more into that in a little bit because he's also my meditation teacher. So that's a big part of my practice.
And you are my meditation teacher. So
and we do a little meditation together. That's right.
Like that.
And I'm also the father of a lovely, beautiful, brilliant 6-year-old girl. And that's a whole other kind of spiritual practice that I know you know about as well.
Yes, exactly. What just stuck out for me the most was when you talk about emotional intelligence. Talk about what that is and why would I want to know about that, right? And how does knowing about that and practicing support me?
Yeah. So emotional intelligence is a broad term, and I like to, whenever I do workshops on that topic, I always like to ask people, what does emotional intelligence mean to you? Because it can really mean a lot of different things. But at least in terms of the model that I was trained in, there are 4 big categories that help us understand what we mean by emotional intelligence. The first one is self-awareness. So this is like understanding, first of all, our own emotions, like being aware of our emotional experience, but then also understanding how our emotions impact the way we behave, the way we perform, the way we interact with other people, the way we navigate different situations. So not just viewing emotions as something that happens inside of us, but really as a powerful driving force for the results that we create in our life. And then so on top of self-awareness, we then start to layer these other aspects, including self-regulation, which is like, how do I, manage, although I don't always love that word, but how do I manage difficult emotions when they show up? And what kind of tools and practices do I have to rebound, to bounce back from those kind of overwhelming, triggering experiences, which we all have, but to find my way back to more of a even baseline. And then also social awareness. That's the third big category. So that's where we get into, like, empathy is a core skill in that kind of bucket. So not just developing my awareness of my own emotional experience, but also learning how to become more sensitive to the emotions of people around me. And then finally, relationship management. So again, in the work of Dan Goleman, that's framed in terms of leadership, like organizational leadership. So some of the skills there have to do with conflict management, influence, inspirational leadership, coaching and mentoring, things like that. But I really just look at it as, like, if I'm able to be aware of my own emotions, be aware of your emotional experience, be able to regulate my emotions, then that puts me in the best position possible to contribute meaningfully to a positive relationship and be of service, really, to the higher possibilities of the relationship itself. So I think that's, for a lot of people who are not necessarily in organizational leadership contexts, I still think emotional intelligence is a critical skill.
Yeah, I think that in the perspective that I just got to echo. I love it because it can be used. The self awareness is just the main key part that I love, and then
That's the
from there,
foundation.
yeah, the foundation, and there that regulation, as you said, because our emotions, not being aware of them, right? And then we respond in so many different ways out of just not being aware. Now, on top of that, then I can be aware that I'm angry, but then how do I regulate that, right? Or what tools do I have to put in place to support me as I go through these different emotions that I go through? And I like that you said, I want to point out that how you said that it really determines how we live our lives and the outcomes of our lives, right? Based on how we respond emotionally to everything. So I love it. I love these steps. It just seems like there's so much more to it, right? Each step has a practice, right? And a tool.
Oh yeah, a lot of practices, a lot of tools. I mean, I think one of the most important practices at that foundational level is body awareness, because emotions always show up in the body. Like, how do we know that we're experiencing a particular emotion? Because we're feeling something, right? Whether it's warmth or tightness in our chest, or flushing of our face, or some kind of like contraction in our stomach, or all these different sensations that show up. We can become more skillful and precise about how we notice those, and then, as you said, sort of work with those. Because one thing that I think is just, can't be emphasized enough is that there are no bad emotions. Like the term negative emotions, we use it, but really it's not the best language, I think. So acceptance, right? That has to be a really important part of developing our emotional self-awareness. And then it's, what do we do with those emotions, where we can get into, like, was this behavior harmful. So probably
Mhm.
that's not a great thing to do with that particular emotion. There's probably a better way to handle that. But the emotion itself isn't bad per
Mhm.
se. You know, it might be uncomfortable, it might be unpleasant, it might be really disruptive, things like that.
Mhm.
But if we categorize certain emotions as bad, then we start to get into relationship with them where we start to think of ourselves as somebody who cannot or does not experience those emotions, and that starts to create like a split in our system, and that makes it actually much harder to work with those emotions when they do show up.
Yeah, and what comes to mind is that's what we were taught, though, and that's what we've heard. Anger is not a good thing, or do not cry is simply a good emotion. And men were saying, don't cry. So, because of the influences that we've had around the emotions, it will take some unlearning, right? Or some new teaching, right? Or something
Yeah.
to have us move to the space where we feel okay with the emotions that we have and we don't necessarily label them as good or bad. So that really takes something too. When we think about transforming people and moving them, to me, it's like teaching them to replace some of the things. It's about replacing. You could say, oh, get rid of that. But if you don't replace it with something, then what? And also, I really want to stress the how. That's the biggest thing. You say, "Oh, let's get you over here." Well, how I'm gonna get there, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, what way can you support me in getting there? So I really like the way this is set out, where you get to walk through the each one of those, you can, all of those different phases can be connected, and then in the end, I love the whole idea of how are you in relationship with people, with your community, with everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty great explanation of emotional intelligence, right?
Yeah. Well, I love I love that word unlearning. I think that's so important. I think a lot of people put a lot of time, myself included, put a lot of time into learning new things. And of course, that's great, but it's actually different than unlearning the things that we've been taught through parents, teachers, media, whatever. Um, those things take up a lot of space in our mind, in our emotional system, and shedding those layers can often be just as valuable as learning anything new, you know?
Mm-hmm,
And I
mm-hmm,
think the how, yeah, that's always the hard part, right? It's like
mm-hmm,
easier said than done, but you know, how do I get from A to B? Um, my feeling is we need the tools, we need the practices, right? We need the kind of the habit, the consistency of working with these things
mm-hmm,
over time. But we also really need support. We need community. We need people around us who are able to uh, both encourage us, but also keep us accountable, you know, who really kind of
mm-hmm,
can hold us in our moments of vulnerability and you know, making mistakes and all this kind of stuff. But then also people who can really, you know, celebrate with us and reflect back to us the progress that we are making and things like that. So for me, having a group of people who you trust and
mm-hmm.
who are share your commitment to growth and development, this is like essential, you know.
Center. Yes, I love everything you're saying. So I kind of like emphasize like the tools, the practice, the consistency, and the support. Key elements, right, that will support you in your transformation. And I like to also, just talk about different tools. What tools are out there for people to use, right, to get from A to B, as you said, right? We talk about community. That's my favorite thing, right? We call it our tribes, and we have different tribes and different communities that support us. And so let's then shift into our tribe, right? Right. Talk about why was the emerging leader, what got you thinking about starting this emerging leader project, and talk about some of the things you've gone through and where you guys are now with it. I was at the beginning, so I understand, right, being at the first retreat, and that's been a few years now, so it's pretty exciting to see the growth and where you are now.
Yeah, we're at a very exciting point in our journey. As you know, we've been cultivating this kind of really intimate container of people that we know and we trust and we love, and that we know have our back while we're sort of testing things, trying things out. And we feel like we're really ready to kind of take it all to the next level going into 2022. So yeah, the original impulse was, as a coach, even though my formal training is in emotional intelligence, a lot of the work that I do in my private client work has to do with purpose. Mm-hmm. So I work with a lot of people who come to me with a sense of, I'm not realizing my potential as fully as I want to be. I'm not living a life that feels really authentic or really meaningful. I don't know if I'm setting the right goals for myself, this kind of thing. So I was working with individual clients for a couple of years when I started to notice that who I was really most interested in working with were people who were not just seeking greater happiness or success just for themselves, but were also looking to really be of service to something larger than themselves as well. Mm-hmm. And I believe that we're living through an incredibly interesting, important, and challenging time in human history, and that we all have the opportunity to participate in creating our shared future, because our global society has been getting more and more complex, more and more disruption, more and more uncertainty. Everything is moving faster, information overload, political polarization, global health pandemics, artificial intelligence. I mean, just everywhere you look, climate change, right? It's like, it's all happening. It's super intense. What's going on, and so, yeah, our kind of starting premise at the Emerging Leaders Project is that we're living at this space between stories. We call it the Great Transition.
Yeah,
it was the name of our show, right? So how do we help to bridge from this old story, this old system that's beginning to decline, into this new story and this new system that's beginning to come online? Mm-hmm. So I felt at a certain point in my coaching work that it would be fun, it would be interesting to see if I could develop kind of like a curriculum, sort of like what you're saying, like a set of tools and practices that I felt would be really essential tools and practices for anybody looking to participate in this great transition process and step up in terms of becoming we use the word leader pretty broadly. We really think that anybody who is recognizing their calling to participate and choosing to step into a life of authenticity and service, that's leadership right there. You're making decisions that are going to have an impact on the people around you. So from that perspective, we wanted to just help people navigate this time and find ways to be to both support their own personal evolution journey, but also be more effective in whatever way they were trying to serve something larger than themselves. And whatever that is up to each individual. Like I don't have an opinion on whether somebody should focus on this big issue or that big issue or whatever. I think we need people working on all the big issues. Right. I think the common denominator is that in order to come up with effective solutions for those issues, we need to also be doing the deeper inner work on ourselves. And we need to be doing both that deep inner work on ourselves and that really important outer work on our societies while we are in a community. We need to be
That's
doing
the
that
community,
work
right?
with other people. So we have
Mm-hmm.
this inner work, the inter work between us, and the outer work on the world. Those are kind of like our three circles, and we really focus on the sweet spot where they intersect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really interesting, because when I think about it, I think about like all of that. And when you talk about navigating this great transition, right? What kind of things have you guys come up with? What techniques or anything that you can talk about to support us in navigating this transition from all this to, I don't want to name it, to this, right? Like you said, like things are crumbling and falling apart over here, but we know something is emerging, right? And so, like, how do we navigate through that? Because I, even just to the point, if we were to start talking about the pandemic, just one aspect of what's going on, right? We are right now back in a space of uncertainty, right?
Very much, yeah.
And so just even in navigating from, we thought everything was cool, right, to now we're panicked again, because I just feel they don't know enough. This is me personally, and talking to different people and trying to just make sure getting the best information. And you mentioned the point about information overload also, right? And knowing how to navigate all that information. And I say, come to that place where you have peace within yourself, right? With all that's going on out there, what is it and what supports you in finding peace within yourself?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's information overload, which is just a lot of information. Then there's also disinformation, right? Like on the
Yep.
internet, it's very
Mhm.
easy to come
Mhm.
across something that looks legit on first glance, but is actually total nonsense, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's also the sort of information bubbles that we can create around ourselves where we're
Yeah.
just only hearing the same opinion that we have, and it's just
Mhm.
confirming our own bias over and over again, right?
Mhm.
So it's not just that there's also the term, I think it's hypernormal stimuli, which is like certain kinds of information that are intentionally designed to hijack our emotions by
Mm.
triggering, deep fears or this kind of us versus them mentality or
Mhm.
things like that. So
Mhm.
yeah, it really is challenging to navigate. And I think one thing I hear in what you're saying is the ability to sift through all of that and come to some place of alignment within ourselves. So part of that, critical thinking is definitely part of that. Part of
Mhm.
that is also intentionally seeking diverse perspectives, right? So
Mhm.
making sure that I'm not just reading only
And one
things
thing,
that
yeah.
are
But
already saying,
I want to say one thing right there before I forget this. I also said to somebody today, we attract a certain energy. So even in what we read, I love that you called it the bubble, because the information that we'll attract will be the information that we want to hear, that's in our bubble, right? So
yeah,
that's a really interesting point when I say, oh, well, because I only read certain things, right? So I'm only attracting, right, certain information, right?
yeah,
It's interesting to step out of that, right? To be open to get out the bubble and then
yeah,
use the critical thinking, as you said. But that was one of the points, because I think the point I'm making is that you can find evidence for what you believe.
exactly. You can find evidence for anything you want. Yep.
You can find it, right? So you set up, and and the evidence will just flow into you.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So that's one of those things
So
about.
it's tricky because you don't like, yeah, on one hand, I'm saying you want to get out of your bubble and go seek different perspectives. But on the other hand, you could end up going down infinite number of rabbit holes and just feeling totally lost. Like, wait, where is reality? You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And again, I think this is why it's one reason why community is so important, because the more we're isolated and trying to like figure all this out on our own, the easier it is to get sucked down one of these rabbit holes, you know? And I think it also points back to the importance of um, cultivating awareness of our body and how does different information impact me in my body, and cultivating awareness of our emotions. Because if I read something and it triggers some, sort of primitive anger response that I'm not even aware of, and then suddenly I'm sharing that and spreading it to a bunch of people, and just spewing more anger, I might not even realize that that's what's happening, but like you're saying, I'm creating this kind of feedback loop, where I'm like, I'm hearing the anger and I'm putting the anger out, and then it's more anger coming back at me because people don't like what I said, and so it's tricky. It's a lot.
It is a lot, and it takes practice. And even with, I say, I love the consistency, because it's a consistent practice that you have to get with. It's like every day I meditate. Or one of the things for me is gospel music, and if when I stop listening to it, when I come back to it, it just confirms for me, that's one of the things that I can find. I can sit, listen to gospel music, and just feel peace overcome me, right? A
Yeah.
sense of everything is going to be all right. And that works for me. But there are many, many different tools that work for people that you could use. I recently started to be creative, and I want to paint a little bit. So that is like, like, wow, just different things that will bring like a certain level of peace when all around me I feel like, things are a little crazy. But
Yeah.
I also appreciate having a community. I have like little community. I love our community with emerging leaders because of the diversity, because of all the people that come together. There's so much learning and sharing and support, right? Um, this just came to my mind. Can you give like a profile kind of our group, or what would you see as not like, I guess it's so
Like our
diverse, right?
target
But
audience.
yeah, our
Yeah.
target, yeah, like that, right?
Yeah, totally. Well, I do, yeah, I think it's interesting because there's this polarity of like sameness and difference, like
Mm-hmm.
diversity, unity, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And so I think we have, like, one of the things we do at the beginning of our community calls is invite people to share some religious or spiritual traditions or practices that are meaningful for them, right? And we hear all kinds of different things, from Buddhism to astrology to sacred sexuality to plant medicine ceremony. Like, it's very diverse in that sense, but almost everybody has something, like
Yeah.
having some kind of a practice as a core part of what keeps us grounded and centered and inspired. I would say that that's like one identifier of somebody in our community, like if you said, who here has some kind of a spiritual practice, most people would raise their hands, but that's going to mean something different to everybody,
Exactly.
And then I would say same thing on the kind of like social change side. Like, we have people doing work in sustainability and environmentalism. We have people doing work in racial justice. We have people doing work in working in education or in local government. We have, lots of people who are healers or coaches or therapists. We have, botanists, right? So like all kinds of different ways that people express themselves through their work. But again, everybody really oriented around service and living a life where they can offer their gifts to creating a more beautiful world, So I think that's, I would say the three things are like, you've got some kind of a personal practice, you've got some kind of an orientation around purpose and service, and you've got some kind of an understanding that we are living through this incredibly potent time and we really need each other. So that's why we get together,
Yeah. I love that. And it worked for us too, as a community. The fact that we're all so diverse, but the part that I love is that we're all about being of service and about the larger community and how we can support that. Love this group, right? So let's shift a little bit and take us on your spiritual journey, Michael. And just give us insight as you grew up. I know you practice Buddhism now, but how did your your spiritual journey start?
Yeah, well, I grew up, I say sort of culturally Jewish. So my parents were divorced when I was little. My dad was Jewish, my mom was not. So I had kind of like a dual religion in my family, but my family was not religious. So it was kind of part of my life, but not so much in a spiritual sense. And then when I was 16, 17 in high school, my first mentor taught a class called The History of Religion. And that was like a sort of comparative religion survey class where we would read some sacred texts from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Native American traditions, Buddhism, Sufism, like all over the place. And that really sparked something for me where I became interested in these kind of deeper underlying truths of the human experience. And my teacher was very explicit about that. He used to say something like, we don't do baby religion. And what he meant by that was the kind of, I'm right and you're wrong kind of a thing. So he was very clear that that was not the context for learning about these different traditions, that this one was right and that one was wrong. It was much more about what can we learn from each of them, and how can we use these different sacred texts to reflect on our own life. So he never gave us tests. He gave us like basically journaling prompts. And so all of our tests were like self-reflection exercises. And he was just looking to see like, how thoughtful are we being about these themes, So that definitely planted a potent seed for me at that time. And he also introduced me to international travel and experiencing different cultures. And so I would say those two things really stayed with me as kind of guideposts for the next like 8 to 10 years, and eventually led me to living in Nepal for about 10 months, where I decided to study Tibetan Buddhism in particular. It was at a very interesting school that was housed inside of a monastery. So it was sort of half traditional Tibetan education style and half Western academic university style. And I spent, about one school year there and just felt totally touched by the teachings. Like I immediately recognized that these practices, this philosophy had some kind of, incredibly profound wisdom in it. But at the same time, I was like, how do I how do I do this in New York City? I'm a 25-year-old. I'm trying to, get my career going. I still got friends and want to go out to the bars and, meet girls and like do all the things that I was doing.
Right.
But, I'm not going to go live at the monastery for the rest of my life, but I want to take what I tasted from that experience and bring it back into my life. So that became kind of like the real core question for me for a long time, still is really. And Buddhist meditation has definitely continued to be a core practice of mine, but I've also layered a whole bunch of other things on top of that since then, everything from yoga to psychotherapy, different kinds of psychotherapy, to journaling, to plant medicine, to prayer. Like after my experience in Nepal, I got very interested in Judaism and I started studying Kabbalah and like wanted to learn more about my own tradition and all this kind of stuff. So I have drawn from many, many sources to craft a practice that feels unique and authentic to me, but is also always evolving, so it's an ongoing process.
I know that you went to One Spirit. I went to One Spirit to study, and it was focused on integral spirituality, right?
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about that experience and how it supported you and how you're using it now in your practices?
Sure, yeah. So it was a friend of mine at my school in Nepal who originally introduced me to the work of Ken Wilber, which he came up with this integral theory, and that's what the program at One Spirit was kind of based on. And when I read his work, it really helped me kind of build that bridge that I was describing between this traditional form of Buddhism that I had encountered in its kind of like native context. How do I take what is relevant from that into a completely different cultural and historical context without losing what is most essential and meaningful? Like I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, right? So, Wilber's work for me, first of all, helped me develop an evolutionary perspective. So the understanding that from the Big Bang until right now, this moment, you and I having this conversation, that's one continuous process. So the way I like to think about it is we are the Big Bang still happening. Like this is the Big Bang. It's still going on. It's still banging. It's still unfolding, right? And we can see how kind of like the process that went from the creation of space and time up through the first particles and hydrogen elements and oxygen and the stars and the galaxies, and then that formed the planets, and eventually life came out of that, right? Somewhere along the way it went from just matter to life, and then life evolved, which we know enough from sort of Darwinian theory about that, how it went from single-celled organisms up through human beings. But then once it got to human beings, there seems to be this another level comes through, which is like culture, art, expression, symbolic language, abstract thinking and reasoning. So a whole new layer of complexity. And that whole process has a kind of a directionality to it, a feeling like it's going somewhere. And we don't know exactly where it's going, but once we kind of wake up, like one of the things I really love about an evolutionary perspective is the idea that we are the evolutionary process becoming aware of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we have that ability to be aware of ourselves as evolution, that allows us to then consciously participate in that process and
Mm-hmm.
be co-creators and help steer that evolutionary process in a more life-sustaining, life-affirming kind of direction. And I think that brings it back to the great transition where like the social systems that we've built over the last several hundred or several thousand years have put us in a position where now we're undermining our ecological foundations of life. You know, like the
Mm-hmm.
biosphere is really threatened, and it's
Mm-hmm.
unclear whether how the human experiment is going to look in another 20, 50, 100, 500 years, you know? So
Right.
that's why I think we're really at this critical moment where our potential is coming online in a new way. And we
Mm-hmm.
really need to tap into that because we're also facing an unprecedented crisis that
Right.
is, you know, really, really challenging. So for
Mm-hmm.
me, the integral approach helps me see that bigger picture and
Mm-hmm.
then have a sense of like how I might fit into that. And then when it comes to kind of like my practices, like I said, I draw from so many different sources. So the
Mm-hmm.
integral model helps give me a little bit of a framework to think about how all
Mm-hmm.
these practices fit together. So
Mm-hmm.
my Buddhist meditation practice is in integral theory language like a first person practice. So I am cultivating a direct experience of myself as a transcendent being, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that I'm that
Mm-hmm.
I'm um, I'm kind of seeing through the separate self sense as a construct and recognizing that my true nature is open, loving awareness, and I get
Mm-hmm.
to experience myself as that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
that's my first person practice. My
Mm-hmm.
second person practice is more of like my prayers, where I'm cultivating a relationship with some kind of divine essence that is a little bit like not quite me, you know? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the language I like to use is beloved source and loving presence. So
Mm-hmm.
people have all kinds of words that they
Right.
like to
Right.
use. You know, the ones that really resonate for me are beloved source and loving presence. And so
Mm-hmm.
when I go into my daily prayers, I'm cultivating this second person relationship between me and the divine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then there's a third person practice, which in my life shows up as partially a a contemplation practice of the mystery, like of the evolutionary mystery itself. So
Mm-hmm.
anytime I, you know, look at the stars or go out in nature or read a book about, you know, science or the brain or whatever, like for me, it just lands like, wow, what like this whole experience is just crazy. Like, what is
Right.
going on? We're just in
Mm-hmm.
this, you know, floating on this little rock in vast, endless space in this huge universe. Nobody knows where it came from or what
Mm-hmm.
came before it or anything.
Right.
It's a complete mystery and a complete miracle, and that just brings me a lot of humility and wonder and awe, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and I really
Mm-hmm.
love that.
Mm-hmm.
And my other third person practice is yeah, like again, service, trying to participate in that, trying to um, like what's my place in all of that, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
how can I participate with these larger systems of nature and of
Mm-hmm.
life, you know?
You know, it's interesting you say that because what comes to mind for me is like purpose. You know, you talk about supporting people and they want to know what their purpose is and finding their purpose and in all of this vastness, right? How do you get to your purpose, you know?
Yeah.
Which is like, I guess, the age old question: Why am I here? What is my
Yeah.
purpose? Right?
Yeah.
What kind of ways do you support people in getting to that as a coach? You know?
Totally. Yeah. Well, obviously it's a process.
It's a
Um,
process,
it's a
right?
process and it's a practice too.
Mhm.
Like I'm not really somebody who believes that you just kind of find your purpose. I mean, I think some people can have that experience.
Mhm.
But I think for the most part, purpose unfolds and you
Mhm.
can't always rush it, or it's not just like sitting there waiting for you to find it. It comes through your life experience. So
Mhm.
I think that what we can do is reflect on things like, what are the experiences I've had in my life where I've experienced the most meaning, the most authenticity, the most flow, the most passion. So I help people kind of think back over their life for those moments when something kind of lit up for them. That can give
Mhm.
us some clues.
Mhm.
The other thing I ask people is, what are the skills that you have, whether those are things that you are naturally good at or things that you have intentionally developed,
Mhm.
because purpose is always about service, which
Mhm.
means that purpose is always about community, because we always are of service to a community around us, to other people, right? Or to the world around us. So we cannot talk about purpose as a kind of isolated thing that I just like sit in my room and figure out what's my purpose and that's
Mhm.
enough.
Right, right.
It has to be through our interaction with the world. So
Mhm.
what are your skills, or your gifts? And then, what are the causes that you care about, or the problems that you care about, or the needs in the world that you care about, that
Mhm.
where you feel like you would, be like to try to make a difference. And then
Mhm.
we kind of look for that sweet spot, like the things that you really enjoy, that light you up, the things that you're good at and have something to contribute, and the places where you feel like you could really make a meaningful difference. That starts to get us closer, I think.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and then I think it's really often comes down to experimenting, like trying things and seeing how it works, how it feels, what you learn from it, and just staying with that process until your purpose gradually unfolds and clarifies and deepens. And then the other thing is that as we get older and our life circumstances change and we learn new things and the world changes around us, our purpose also evolves. So there might be
Mhm.
certain elements of it that stay pretty consistent over the course of our life,
Mhm.
but how we express that, like what form that takes, can
Mhm.
totally change. So
Mhm.
I might
Mhm.
be really passionate and feel totally purpose driven doing something for 5 years, and then suddenly it's like doesn't quite have that fire to it anymore.
Mhm.
That's normal. That's not a
Mhm.
bad thing. That just
Mhm.
means I'm evolving and I get to keep asking myself the question, okay, what's my purpose now?
Yeah, I like that too. And what rings for me is people wanting to know what their purpose is. And I was sitting there thinking, do people between the age of 20 and 30 want to know their purpose? Or as you get to be 50 and older, are you looking for your purpose? Right? It's like the at what point, do we really start to like say, well, what is my purpose and why am I here? And not everybody even gets to that point of looking at, well, what is my purpose? People are just like living their life on automatic without, and I get it's how life unfolds for you, whether that comes up, what is my purpose? And I guess being in the communities that I'm in and the people that I'm attracted to in my world, it's really about service. What is my purpose? I'm the momentum community. I love it because it's really that service part. It's about you developing, but it's also about the world and how, what is your contribution to the world? And that community works for that. I love that, right? We get to like do all our transformation on ourselves, but we also get to put it out in the world and talk about how we want to serve. So that component of and I love community, right? And I'm always connected in some great communities. I participate in Momentum because the practices and the way they take you from where you are to where you want to go, it's amazing. The one thing, and I know there are many different processes and practices that can take you there, and all of them you have to commit to, or you get what you put into it. There's the consistency in how you would approach your transformation. And yeah. So with
Yeah.
that, right?
No, totally. And I mean, I think as much as I value things like individual practices, I think service is maybe the most transformational practice we can take on, you know? So I think that, you know, that's why we hold those two things as fundamentally being not separate. Like we can't really be of service unless we're doing the work on ourselves, and the real work on ourselves comes from being of service, you know? So they really kind of go hand in hand. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question about purpose, and, you know, who's asking that question and why and things like that. I think about, first of all, I think that purpose itself has become kind of a buzzword in our culture, whether that's in the, you know, business leadership space, or whether that's in the kind of social media, you know, like entrepreneur, big, like, you know, everybody wants to be living their purpose, you know? And I think that comes with shadow, which is that people start to feel like if they're not living their purpose, something's wrong with them. They're failing. They're not good enough. They're supposed to be somebody that they're not, all this kind of stuff. So that's one thing I really look for when I start working with a new client is like, where is this question coming from? And how are you interpreting what it means to be living your purpose? Because it's not about, you know, getting to like say on Instagram that you're living your purpose, you know, like that's
right, exactly, right.
But I do think that can happen for folks, and they feel like not only they have to be living their purpose, but they have to be starting a 7-figure business, and they have to be, you know, doing all the fancy vacations, and it's like, no, none of that is really real. And imagine if we lived in, you know, a village of 100 people, 150 people, and those people all knew you very intimately because they were, you know, there when you were born, and they knew your parents, and they knew your grandparents, and they know all your aunts and uncles and all your cousins and all this. It's like, I'm not sure that the question of purpose arises in the same way in that kind of a context, because who we are and what our role is in that community would probably be more obvious, you know? Now, I'm not saying this is like a rule and it's, oh, you know, this is a kind of a generalization and a thought experiment, you know? But I think when we live in a culture where, you know, people are trying to get 3,000 friends on Facebook, but don't have 3 people in their life that they can be vulnerable with, like that creates a different kind of a mix where suddenly I want to feel like I'm doing something big, because that's what's going to get people to see me and to value me and to want to connect with me. So I have a sense of belonging and intimacy, you know? So I think a lot of the very fundamental elements of what makes us feel whole and happy and fulfilled as human beings have been eroded by the kind of social and cultural context that we live in. And then you see things like, oh, I want to find my purpose showing up in a little bit of a different way because those things aren't there as much as they probably ought to be, if that makes sense.
That absolutely makes sense. And as you were talking about all the social media and the way we're doing interacting with each other, and really basing our worth on how many followers we have, right? Basing our life on, followers and likes, right? Becomes so important, right? Just we're getting close to the end. Talk a little bit about your God, I got so many questions now. I don't even know, and I'm running out. Yeah, when we talk about social entrepreneurship, right? Break that down a little bit for us, for people to understand what we mean by that.
Sure. So for me, social, I mean, yeah, again, it's a very broad category, but for me, why I use that term is because I believe that business, in a very basic sense, has something to do with solving problems and meeting needs in a way that creates value for all of the stakeholders involved in the enterprise, and can also be like a vehicle for self-expression. So for me, social entrepreneurship, this project of mine, this business that I'm trying to build, it's an act of creation. It's like art, like there's something in me that wants to be expressed. And the medium for that is not paint, it's not music, it's not poetry, it's this project, right? So there's some sacred quality to using the form of business as a vehicle for both creative self-expression and a way, an amazing innovation that humans came up with around how we can organize ourselves to make incredible things happen, to adapt our environment to make our lives better. And I think social entrepreneurship now also has this responsibility to kind of, what's the word, like what's the word, to kind of make amends. That's not the word I'm looking for, but to sort of like make up for all the damage that we have done through traditional forms of business over the last several decades and centuries, because patriarchal imperialist capitalism has been really, really shitty for a lot of people and our planet. So we need to undo some of that damage, and I believe that business has a role to play in part of that. It's not just business by any means, but certainly business is included,
Right. What comes to mind for me is when I was in corporate, the whole social responsibility that, businesses would say. They had these certain ways that they would do different projects or give money to, quote, say they are being socially responsible, right?
Yeah.
And so that it's interesting, we're still on the same holding them accountable. Are you really being responsible socially? And just bringing it to the table and bringing it up, and not just letting it slide when they say, oh, I've donated this money, yes, my social responsibility. Really, what's the impact of that? So it's been really.
I was just going to say that also connects with purpose. Like, what is the business's purpose? How can the business be of service? Businesses need to earn money, otherwise they don't work, so it's not about excluding that, but it is about putting these other things like the planet and the people and the purpose kind of on a more even playing field with the money as well.
So we are coming to the end of the show. I'd like to give you a moment to leave our audience with something key that they can take away and use.
Mm. Yeah, well, since we've talked about emotional intelligence and community and purpose and the great transition, all of these things, I think a practice that's so powerful is asking for feedback. So if you have a couple of people in your life that you trust and you're wondering how you can grow or evolve or improve in some area in your life, go ask somebody for feedback. What do you see as my strengths? What do you see as my opportunities for improvement? What do you see as my natural gifts? What has been the impact that I've had on you or the people, so there's lots of really great questions that we can ask a few people around us. And in my experience, getting those reflections is incredibly powerful. So that would be my tip.
Yeah. But thank you so much for joining me. It's been really a great conversation. And I'll see you at the next meeting, but we'll be in touch. I'll keep in touch on the WhatsApp.
Awesome. Thank you, Rev G. It was so fun to be here with you, and we're so glad to have you in our community. So I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Okay, thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for joining me tonight on Conversations with Reverend G. And I'm here every Monday night at 8 p.m. You can find me every day on Facebook as Reverend Grenetta Mason, on Instagram as Rev Grenetta, and also on YouTube as Reverend Grenetta Mason. I'd like to leave you with the words for today. What is your purpose, and how are you looking to find out what your purpose is? And I love the way Michael talked about how it evolves. Also, happy holidays. I know it's the holiday season, and everybody go out and don't go out, but right, have a great time. Like, don't go out, but make the most of the holiday season. Find your joy and be happy in any moments that you can, because living our life moment by moment is what is best. So I love you all. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I will definitely be here next week, 8 p.m. WEMS Radio Live.